There's not the slightest doubt in my mind that Iran has a nuclear program for the purpose of building nuclear weapons. They have a long history as a state sponsor of terrorism, and as a state sponsor of terrorism, I would expect to do them nothing less, for them to do nothing less than to try to use a nuclear weapon in some form or fashion against their perceived enemies, which of course would be the State of Israel and the United States of America. We should not forget that when Al-Qaeda chose to strike on that tragic day, September the 11th, 2001, they did not pick skyscrapers in Israel. What substance will create a nuclear weapon, a nuclear explosion? And the answer is uranium. And uranium is a naturally occurring substance in the Earth's crust. There are many places in the Earth that have small amounts of uranium, but just as you might look upon nuclear weapons as a curse upon humanity, so there has been a blessing, and the blessing is there are only 3 major deposits of uranium ore in the world. One is in Australia, the other is in Canada, and the third is in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan had been part of the Soviet Union. Australia and Canada are, of course, British Commonwealth countries, and there were no problems with obtaining uranium from Australia or Canada for America's buildup of nuclear weapons. This explains in part why the United States and the Soviet Union had, and to this day still have, despite the strategic arm limitations agreements, very substantial arsenals of nuclear weapons. We had access to large deposits of uranium from which to build these nuclear weapons. It also explains why other countries, like France and China, have relatively small nuclear arsenals. A nuclear arsenal of 200 to 300 thermonuclear weapons is still a devastating arsenal, but compared to the many thousands that the United States and the Soviet Union accumulated, it is relatively small. There is a 4th place in the world that, while it does not have a large deposit of uranium, has a very rich deposit of uranium. And that will definitely be a factor as we discuss the Israeli nuclear program. That place in the world is South Africa. South Africa, as many of you know, is an absolute treasure house of minerals. Diamonds and gold and platinum and you name what is precious to humankind, and the chances are very good it can be found in South Africa. Plutonium-239 and uranium-238 are what are used to build nuclear weapons. Uranium-235 is what is used for nuclear power plants. Now, you can refine uranium-235 into plutonium-239 and make weapons-grade material, fissionable material out of it. And that is the explanation for why countries like Iran, with vast oil deposits and no need to rely on nuclear power for their energy needs, still seem to want to have a nuclear power program and claim, well, we're just doing this for peaceful purposes. We're going to build nuclear power plants. Why would you build a nuclear power plant if you are sitting on top of so much oil as is Iran? It's right at hand. You can generate all your electricity from oil. But if you have the nuclear power plants plus the technology plus the equipment, which is a very important factor, you can then make the step to a nuclear weapons arsenal. Okay, so what is yellow cake? Yellow cake is merely semi-refined uranium ore, more easily transportable than raw uranium ore. The next term I'd like to talk about, just to lay the foundation, is how we measure nuclear yield. the yield, the power, the force of a nuclear weapon. It is measured by thousands or millions of tons of TNT. Well, what is TNT? TNT was first discovered by German chemists in 1869, but it took several more decades to develop a manufacturing process by which it could be made cheaply enough to be used commercially or for weaponry. But that was developed, and in World War II and even before World War I, it was manufactured and used in massive amounts, and it became the standard for measuring the power of an explosion. Nuclear weapons are measured by their equivalent TNT power in tons, or thousands of tons, or even in millions of tons. The atomic bombs that we dropped on Japan, on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, were measured in thousands of tons of TNT. Strontium-90 is especially worrisome. The human body mistakes strontium-90 for calcium, which means it will be ingested and it will be directly used by the human body for bone tissue, teeth tissue, directly leading to bone cancer, leukemia, bone marrow cancer, especially worrisome for children because their bones and their teeth are growing and they are consumers of milk. And this poison, this radioactive poison, was spread throughout the world, and the world said, "What are you doing? How can you be doing this to the atmosphere of life ship Earth that we all breathe?" An enormous pressure was brought on the Soviet Union, as well as, to a certain extent, the United States and the other nuclear power at the time, which is Great Britain. 1963, only 3 nuclear powers in the world: the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain. And with that international pressure, all 3 countries agreed to ban the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. Now, this is going to be important later as I discuss the Israeli nuclear option and how the fact that this arsenal of weapons sitting in a bunker somewhere has an extraordinary benefit for Israel if it is never used. Just the fact that it is down there and it might be used is of an extraordinary benefit to Israel. Not until 1960 did France develop nuclear weapons. And then we think China was the 5th country. And then the 6th country, at least among the countries that are claiming to have nuclear weapons, was India. There was a pause in the world for well more than a decade, followed by Pakistan, and a few years ago, North Korea claimed, and the evidence is incontrovertible at this time, that they have a very small arsenal of nuclear weapons. And that's where it stands in the world today. Israel had its cast of characters, and I'd like to name the 3 principles, the 3 most important of that cast of characters in the Israeli nuclear weapons program. One was David Ben-Gurion. Now, you all know who was David Ben-Gurion, a very strong believer in Israel's need to have a nuclear program for energy, for research, and for weaponry. In 50, 51, 52, on the eve of the declaration of the State of Israel, in May 1948, there were 600,000 Jews in the British Mandate Palestine. By 1953, when most of the immigration from the Arab world was complete, plus the European Jews from the displaced persons camps of Europe, the population of Israel was over 2 million. In a matter of a few years, the population of Israel tripled. Okay, second person in the cast of characters that I want to talk about was a German Jew by the name of Ernst David Bergman. Now, had there never been a Hitler, I strongly suspect Ernst David Bergman would have lived out his life in Germany as Ernst Bergman and described himself as a German of Mosaic persuasion. That was how the German Jews before the rise of Hitler described themselves. But Hitler did rise to power. And Ernst David Bergman faced the same exact fate as people like Einstein and Szilard and Teller and Ullmann. He had a brilliant career ahead of him. He had earned his PhD from the University of Berlin in organic chemistry in 1927, top of his class, and immediately went on to co-author the accepted German language textbook on organic chemistry. He had to leave. He left for London, where he came to the attention of Chaim Weizmann, who at that time was a prominent voice and prominent face for world Jewry. Chaim Weizmann. He would in time become the first president of the state of Israel. Chaim Weizmann was an important factor in the early days of Israel, both before the Declaration of Independence and thereafter. I strongly, very strongly suspect that the top element of the Jewish community in Palestine in the days of the British Mandate, well aware of what was going on in Nazi Germany and of the very bright people who were leaving Nazi Germany, kept their eyes on who got out. And Ernst David Bergman was matched to Chaim Weizmann. Once he is in Israel, he becomes very close friends with David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion, after the establishment of the State of Israel, will give Ernst David Bergman an Israeli governmental job and the title of Science Advisor to the Defense Ministry. When it came time in 1951 to create an Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, Ernst David Bergman would head it, and he would go on to be the director of Israel's nuclear energy program. Now that brings me to the third character, the third very interesting character I want to point out. There, of course, were many others, just like there were for our program, but the third in the trio was Shimon Peres, who became the 8th Prime Minister of Israel and the 9th President. Shimon Peres was not born Shimon Peres. He was born Szymon Persky in eastern Poland. Shimon Peres was raised in many ways by his grandfather, a rabbi. Oh, by the way, if I didn't mention it, Ernst David Bergman was the son of a prominent German rabbi. In 1941, the German army rolls into eastern Poland, captures the shtetl of Shimon Peres' family, and the historical record reflects that the follow-up troops rounded up the Jews from the shtetl, forced them into the synagogue, set the synagogue on fire, and they were all burned to death, inside, burned alive inside the synagogue. This is the imagery that exists in the minds of David Bergman, David Ben-Gurion, and Shimon Peres. You can understand now why they are so determined that Israel will have a nuclear weapons program, will have the ability to say to the world, the true ability to say to the world, never again. Shimon Peres, from the very beginning, has played an important role in the life of Israel. David Ben-Gurion recognized him for his capabilities when he was a very young man. And when he was in his early 20s, David Ben-Gurion put Shimon Peres in charge of weapons procurement for the Haganah. Israel realized it's going to need some help. There were a unique political landscape in the 1950s in France. France was having enormous troubles at that time with its colony in Algeria. And for this reason, the attitude within the French government of the time was susceptible to an approach from Shimon Peres. He led the effort to establish a reciprocal relationship with France for the development of nuclear energy. And so France teamed up with Israel. Now, this was not a lopsided arrangement. France did have the industrial base, but Israel contributed a lot of the know-how. But that relationship came to an end. However, it came to an end after Israel got what Israel needed. Israel needed a partner with uranium. And in the early 1970s, Israel found that partner in the apartheid government of South Africa. Israel was a pariah country. Apartheid South Africa was a pariah country. Apartheid South Africa had the uranium deposits. Israel had the brain power. They formed one of those deals with the devil, because you need to survive, you need to live. And the end result was that by the time the apartheid government fell, which I think was in the late 80s, Israel had obtained enough refined uranium ore equivalent to somewhere between 200 and 400 megatons of nuclear destruction. And Israel helped South Africa, apartheid South Africa, build 2 nuclear weapons. The third little window, very brief window, comes from American reconnaissance satellites. We launched a series of satellites intended to provide photographic coverage over the entire world, starting in the late 1960s, called the Vela satellites. And in 1979, on September the 22nd, 1979, a Vela satellite captured the very characteristic double flash of a nuclear explosion. Captured it about 500 miles to the southeast of the southernmost tip of Africa. Now, of course, this was during the time when Israel was cooperating with the apartheid governments of South Africa. And the speculation is that was an Israeli nuclear weapons test. Why would anyone else test weapons way down there? But of course, Israel can't do a nuclear test underground because Israel is opposed to, relatively speaking, it's a postage stamp country. So that is the window, the windows that have given us what we know. And what do we know? Based on the release of documents from the government of South Africa, we know that Israel has obtained enough uranium to give it the capacity to build 200 to 400 nuclear weapons in the 1 megaton range. It is an enormously powerful arsenal. Now, it is a fraction of what the U.S. has. It's a fraction of what the Soviet Union has. It's about equal to what China has. It's about equal to what Great Britain has, about equal to what France has. France, Great Britain, and China are kind of happy to hold their nuclear arsenal at that level because they know at that level you possess enough capacity to create a nuclear Armageddon that no one is going to want to cause you much trouble. But of course you need a delivery system. Well, Israel has a good delivery system also. It has the Israeli Air Force. No question that the Israeli Air Force is a top-notch Air Force. There is some concern at present whether the Israeli Air Force at present has the capability to refuel in flight and successfully attack the nuclear facilities in Iran. But if they had to, they'd find a way to overcome that problem, I am sure. And Israel has modern submarines. Israel has 3 modern submarines with 2 more on the way. The first 2 were given to Israel by Germany. The third was sold at half price, and Israel has a contract to purchase 2 more at full price from Germany. Is there any question in anybody's mind that Germany can make superbly good submarines? They led the way. They were the innovators of submarine warfare, and they haven't lost their touch. They make submarines to this day in German dockyards. And the talk is that Israel has equipped them with cruise missiles, no question, but that Israel has the capability to make cruise missiles. And the cruise missiles are armed with nukes, and the submarines go out into the Mediterranean, and they are part of Israel's deterrent force, just as submarines are a part of our nuclear deterrent force. The speculation is that if Israel exercises the option to purchase the other 2, they will be docked in Eilat. One will always be in the Arabian Sea. When Hosni Mubarak, good friend of the United States, was in power in Egypt, he isn't anymore. Now he's chained to his bed and dragged into a courtroom to be tried as a criminal. But when he was in power, he allowed an Israeli submarine to transit from the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal to the Gulf of Suez, and then from there to the Red Sea, and then from there to the Arabian Sea. The speculation is he did that as a message to the Iranians, we, Egypt, do not like the idea of you building nuclear weapons. Okay, Israel also has missiles, very sophisticated missiles capable of launching satellites into space. Israel has launched satellites into space. The missiles are called Jericho 1, and then Jericho 2, and then Jericho 3. They are intercontinental ballistic missiles. They can put a satellite into space. They can put a nuclear warhead pretty much anywhere on the globe. That is Israel's delivery system. And there have been articles which have been published speculating on the fact that Israel, Prime Minister after Prime Minister of Israel, has, in carefully worded comments, said Israel will never be the first nation to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. Menachem Begin said it just like that, looking into the cameras. Well, you can say that if you have a nuclear arsenal and you keep it hidden and you don't tell anyone about it, and then you release to the press the quaint little story about how all your nuclear weapons are 1 screw short of completion. And all you have to do is get out the screwdriver and put in the last screw, and then they are ready to go, fire them up and send them on their way. But until that last screw is in place, you are not introducing nuclear weapons. That's one of those. This is why I chose the title, A Secret Beneath a Thin Veil. Also, Israel found a way to release the story into the world press that when they built their first nuke, welded onto the casing in both Hebrew and English were the words, "Never again." Okay, now that brings me to the end of what I want to talk to you, which is, why do this all? I would like you to imagine that you are an American president. And whatever your politics may be and your attitude towards Israel may be, there is a war in the Middle East. And things are not going well for Israel. You know, we like to think Israel good, strong. Israel got that good Air Force. Well, 5 million people facing off against 200 million people, like the Russians said on the battlefields of the Eastern Front. Quantity has a quality all its own. Israel is faced off against 200 million hostile Arabs, and the numbers are gradually becoming even more out of balance. The population growth rate in Israel is among the high, in Egypt is among the highest in the world. Egypt will soon have 100 million people. Makes the forward thinking very scary if the Islamic Brotherhood should come to complete power through the democratic process in Egypt. Okay, so you're an American president, and there's another war in the Middle East, and things are not going well for Israel, and the Israeli Defense Force is being pushed back. They were pushed out of the Golan in the first few days of the Yom Kippur War. And you know that Israel has 200 to 400 nukes with an attitude. And took the trouble to weld onto the casing of the first one, and maybe others as well, in Hebrew as well as English, the words "never again." And now your advisors are telling you what would the consequences be if Israel released 200 to 400 megatons of nuclear destruction upon the Islamic world. I have tried to research that subject. I've spent many hours on the internet trying to find out what would happen to the world's atmosphere if there were a simultaneous detonation of 200 to 400 megatons of nuclear destruction over urban centers. And I could not come up with an absolute answer, probably because, this is one of the questions, you don't really know what the answer will be until it happens. We'll never know when Hitler would have had an atom bomb if he had been able to keep working on it. We will never know how many Jews could have been saved from the Holocaust if there had been in Israel 10 years earlier. These are questions we will never know the answer to. And until hopefully we never do learn the answer to what will be the effect of a major exchange of nuclear weapons upon the Earth's atmosphere. But whatever the answer is, it will not be good. It will not be good for humanity. And now you're the American president who is told, they're not going quietly, Mr. President. It's not in their nature, not after what happened to them in the Holocaust. Would you want Israel to have enough support and enough weaponry, conventional weaponry, so it would not be forced to rely upon its nuclear arsenal? Mm-hmm. And that is the big benefit to the state of Israel, mm-hmm. of having a nuclear arsenal. And I want to thank you all very, very much for being here, and for whatever support you may choose to provide to the Torah Learning Center, to my friend, Rabbi Karch.
Wonderful.
You're welcome.